everyone, to another episode of Pharmacy Benefit Facts in under 15 minutes. Today, we're going to discuss PBMs and pharmacy ownership and how this conflict of interest can negatively impact plan sponsors and members. Now, all guests on this show are special, but today's guest may be even a little more so. Today, we have with us the man who started it all, TrueScript's founder, Nathan Gabhart. And also joining us is one of our very good friends and strong partners, Chris Antipas. Both of these men are pharmacists by background, but they also share an eagerness or mental illness that has drove them to become much more deeply involved in this whole pharmacy space. That includes everything from PBM ownership to independent pharmacy, legislative involvement, patient advocacy, all of it. They have really walked all the walks, which is why I'm so excited to have them here today to talk the talk. So now, Nathan, before we really get into how and why pharmacy ownership by a PBM is a conflict of interest, I would love for you to just kind of level set and give our listeners a brief overview of the role that a PBM plays with the pharmacies it contracts with.
Sure. No, thank you, Allie, and thank you, Chris, for joining. I was telling Chris while we were chatting earlier that doing webinars with guys that are smarter and better looking is very intimidating. So we'll see how that goes. But regarding the PBM pharmacy relationship, really, it's such a critical relationship. I mean, I'm a pharmacy owner by background. I'm a community pharmacist advocate and president of the associations, very involved back in the day. And ultimately, the PBM is the one who ultimately decides what drug the patient gets and what pharmacy they get that prescription filled at. So the PBM has a very important role in this relationship in protecting the client and the member. So therefore, if the PBM has any sort of financial benefit from the drug manufacturers or the pharmacies, then in my personal opinion, that's a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. So I just think it's imperative that PBMs should never own pharmacies. And now we have situations where pharmacies own PBMs. That's the same thing. So I think the ownership is extremely detrimental to the patient. And ultimately to other pharmacies, because it should be the patient's decision on which pharmacy they use, and it should be the pharmacy's decision on which PBM contract they want to participate in. So the PBM should be a PBM, administer the claims, make sure we get the right drug at the right cost for the right patient, and that should be our space.
Definitely. And so, Chris, based on Nathan's description there, it's really easy to see that when a PBM's responsibility is to negotiate with pharmacies on the client's behalf, it's just a clear as day inherent conflict of interest when a PBM owns the pharmacy they are negotiating with. So can you kind of expand on that concept and provide an example or two of how PBMs can manipulate the system in order to drive revenue to themselves through the pharmacies they own?
Yeah, I think it's to expand on Nathan's point. One of the roles of the PBM is to hold the pharmacy network accountable. So pharmacies make mistakes, sometimes on accident and other times on purpose. And regardless of the type of mistake, whether it's adding an extra zero to the amount of medication you're billing for but not dispensing, the PBM is charged with overseeing that. And one of those areas that we see that regulated is through pharmacy audits. And a PBM that owns the pharmacy is disincentivized to audit their own pharmacy. And I don't even know if it happens today, honestly. I think that I've asked that question and I've never gotten an answer. And so the oversight and accountability is a really important vehicle to ensure that claims are flowing through appropriately. And, whether it's not auditing their own pharmacies or overpaying pharmacies that they own or directing patients to pharmacies that they own, think that however you slice that up, I mean, ultimately it is important to call out the fact that the members, the patients, the human beings that are suffering are being tortured by these methods, these rules, which are driven by the greed of, you know, self-dealing.
Right, steering the customer to your
Yeah.
own pocketbook.
Yeah.
And to the final point that I'll make on this, just on this talk track, is that we believe, at least I believe, and I think most people in this country would agree, that competition is the key to cost management, and freedom of choice is necessary for true competition to exist. And every state, I'm personally licensed in 22 states. And so I'm very familiar with various state regulations on pharmacy. Every state that I've studied to pass their law exam, it's clear that they want patients to be free to choose their pharmacy. And that's a really important provision that somehow is mysteriously overlooked whenever we get into the PBM space and employer sponsored plans. So I think it's really critical, not only addressing the conflict of interest, but understanding issues that are causing drug costs to inflate. The lack of competition is a very important part of that, and choice is also tied to that.
For sure. And Chris, we know you here as a very active and passionate patient advocate, pharmacist. And so while you're on that same breadth of how these manipulative practices could actually harm a member's healthcare experience, by limiting their access to care, I also want you to kind of touch on the manipulation that can occur or would occur when a PBM owns their own pharmacies and is also conducting their own in-house prior authorizations. They're wanting to rubber stamp those things with yes and push those maybe high cost specialty drugs through to be filled at their pharmacies. How can that affect the patient experience?
Yeah, so I'll briefly touch on this. Essentially, in a model where the pharmacy benefit manager generates income, revenue, and profits from spread pricing on the drug, from the retention of rebates, as well as I'm a pharmacy owner. And so my pharmacies make money on spread, right? I get a reimbursement that's higher than what I paid for the drug, hopefully in most cases. Unfortunately, pharmacies sometimes, and maybe more often than not, are getting paid below that number. But the point is, pharmacies make money on the spread. When a PBM owns their own pharmacy and also conducts their business in a manner that is spread pricing, if they are conducting a prior authorization review, when that prior authorization is denied, they make zero money. When the prior authorization is approved, they make money on the spread price between what they charge the client and what they pay the pharmacy. There's a margin there. They make money on the rebate because they're retaining a portion of that rebate before they pass on the rest to the client. And then when they own the pharmacy, they also make a margin at the dispense level. And that profit is generated not just once, it's generated every single time that claim is filled. So in-house prior authorization, what we found, and I've personally seen this in actually some of my clients, where the prior auth is approved, but for my clients, I actually have a process where I will review prior auths for the PBM that the PBM conducts on behalf of my client. And I've seen multiple scenarios where I've questioned, why was this approved? There's the clinical evidence you provided me is completely inadequate. And then when I reach back out to the PBM, they say, oh, you're right. We shouldn't have approved this. It must have squeaked by.
As I hear the discussion and just as I recollect, my 15, 16 years in the PBM industry, and also my role in county government and elected leadership, confusion through complexity is a phrase I hear often. And I think that's something we have to be cautious of in the PBM industry, because what happens is we start throwing around all these different ways PBMs can manipulate things to generate revenue. And there's probably 4 or 5 main categories on how they can do that. We have to be careful though, because what could happen is the lowest revenue option that the PBM is doing is probably the one they're willing to clean up the first. So therefore, there can be this sense of euphoria that, hey, we fixed this because our RFP doesn't allow PAs to be done in-house. So there's this sense of, oh, we fixed it. Well, all they have done is basically just sacrifice their lowest margin manipulative tool to make the end user think you got us. Okay, we're not going to do that to you. We got to keep this high level. What are your vendors charging you? Because once we start talking about RFPs and MACs and NDCs, and it's going to be this whole crazy train all over again. But just know that there's a number of ways that if you own your own pharmacies, you have even greater tools to manipulate revenue because you control more of the revenue stream. Because obviously the drug cost is the majority of the overall cost of the prescription drug programs is the actual cost of the drug. Now, why is it high? We can argue that back and forth, but the cost is the highest portion, is what is actually paid for the drug. Now, who keeps that is kind of where the problem lies. So I say that to say this: if the pharmacy is in control of which drug product they get, which manufacturer they get, 86% of all the prescription drugs are going to be generics. Out of those generics, you're going to have 10 to 20 manufacturers for each product. So you have 10 to 20 different options theoretically that a pharmacy could order from. If I own a pharmacy, I could set all of my contracts with my clients based off of an AWP model. So I can give all my clients AWP minus 85% off of all generics. And 85% would probably knock their socks off because it's such a high number. But your costs are going to go up 20% because the average reimbursement on the MAC side is AWP minus 90%. So the fact of the matter is if I know I've got an AWP-based contract, especially on generics or single source generics, I'm going to order the highest AWP products that I can. AWP is not what the pharmacy pays. It's the average wholesale price, which the manufacturer sets, and only the manufacturer sets. There could be some cases where if it's a large enough package size, if I have a robot and I need a bottle of 10,000, so that I can just open that bottle one time and put it in my robot, it's going to have its own NDC number, which then gets assigned its own AWP number. Now, if you only have one purchaser of it, who do you think helps determine that AWP price? It's the purchaser and the seller. So you do not want the pharmacy having any sort of role in determining what's the average wholesale price of that product. That should be the role of the PBM, where we simply eliminate that model and simply say, hey, here's our maximum allowable cost. We don't care what the AWP is. Find the best acquisition cost to the pharmacy. You're going to perform well on an RFP because you can make it look like your AWP discounts are much greater than had you used Chris's pharmacy. But if you use Chris's pharmacy, he's not going to get reimbursed off AWP. He's going to get MAC. So your cost is going to be different. So it's just so confusing. But you cannot generate $180 billion of revenue, and this is 2018 numbers, when you charge a zero admin fee. Even in government, it's not.
That should be common sense.
Government math.
You would government math is that even worse than fifth grade math and common sense. So many avenues of manipulation, and you hit the nail on the head. The confusion through complexity is a tactic used by so many, and fortunately, that's not our MO. We're doing everything we can here at TrueScripts to peel back those onion layers. And for our listeners, I know we just went through a lot of information in a very short amount of time. And I know from firsthand experience that these two could continue this conversation on well into the night. So for any listeners who are interested in continuing that conversation and learning more and picking the brains of these masterminds, please reach out. I'll be happy to connect you. And we're happy to educate this industry. You know, we're not out just to make sales for TrueScripts. We're out to build an industry of knowledgeable purchasers so that we can truly make a change and make a difference in this space. So if you want to shoot an email to partnerwithus@truescripts.com, that will get you where you need to be.